What's a representative sample? When you've got a grow room that's got 4,000 plants, you've got colas on top, you get in the middle part of the plant and the bottom, you've got different sizes of these nugs, and they have different cannabinoid profiles. They vary. So is taking the top cola from the tallest, burliest plant going to be representative of what that entire batch that's going to be packaged into thousands of units and sent to consumers? Heck no, we know that to be false. So guess what? Can you think of anything else in the world that might not be fully representative? I mean, even tomatoes and blueberries and strawberries, they have size differences. What's different though is that it has the potential to intoxicate or impair you. That THC value matters.
Welcome to How to Flourish in Cannabis. I'm your host, Brian Weber. Our topic today, GMP, cannabis, and cannabinoids. How to Flourish in Cannabis is an educational focused show with experienced leaders in regulated cannabis. Our guests have a wide range of industry experience in law, insurance, real estate, and today, an expert in cannabis standards and operations. No pitches here. This is designed to be a masterclass in regulated cannabis. How to Flourish in Cannabis is our effort to educate and elevate. I'm very excited to have on today David Vaillencourt, founder of both GMP Collective and S3 Collective. David, thank you for joining today. I really appreciate you being on.
Brian, thanks for having me. It's been great getting to know you and Colton and the team over at Flourish over these last few years.
We've been chatting for a few years. We kind of work in similar spaces and supporting good practices, but there's a lot of stuff going on with cannabis today. And I wanted to make sure, especially as we're moving from, hopefully to a Schedule 3 environment from a Schedule 1 and timely news of some California production issues, but there's always issues that are going on in this space, and how to be better manufacturers and also how to stand up new standards for an industry that really didn't exist before. If there was one expert in this industry I could think of to talk about those, it is you. And that is why you're our guest today. So if you are a grower in cannabis, a manufacturer in cannabis, or anybody who is an engineer, scientific operations type person, especially if you're coming from the pharma industry, drug industry, this is your show today. So David, could you give the audience a little bit of background? I've known you for a few years, but can you give us a little bit of background of how you got into cannabis, what you guys are doing here at both those organizations, and what you're trying to build, as we become a more mature and legal industry?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Brian, and folks out there. I hope you enjoy this episode. So my background, I'm a researcher. I'm a scientist by education. I've got a master's in science, studied climate change in my first kind of phase of career in life. And I did a lot of government contracting. So I understood how to inject science, follow standards, and handle bureaucratic red tape, which is always fun, right? Who doesn't love that? Kind of just through curiosity, I met some folks that were standing up cannabis operations, one of the first vape pens in California, and was just asking questions around the safety and how these products are made. I was just really curious, and essentially, asked the question like, do you have standard operating procedures for this? How do you ensure that when your PhD leaves and goes back to Purdue for the, or wherever he was for the next year, that the technician you bring in is going to be able to do it in the same way, the same formulation, the same viscosity, have the same effect? And he's like, good question. Don't know. Don't have an answer. I was like, are you even legal? And this is, for context, 2015. So this is the Compassionate Use Act in California. Before there were, it was more of a co-op and collective model. And so that curiosity kind of drove me. I was actually living in Louisiana at the time, working on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill assessment, managing that for the Department of Interior and the environmental assessment. And a long way to say, that wrapped up, worked ourselves out of a job when BP and Department of Justice settled for about $60 billion, and had successfully worked myself out of a job and was able to move to Colorado. Got involved in the industry there, ended up on a plane in 2017 to Toronto, Canada for the first ASTM International Standards meeting on cannabis. And I knew what standards were conceptually, but it's something that we all take for granted. And when you realize that there are no standards, that starts to explain a lot about why there's a lack of a supply chain and a lack of a credible industry and a minimum, a floor for us to all operate under a shared set of rules. So that was really the catalyst. I haven't looked back since. It's been over 7 years now. That led me to form the GMP Collective, where we bring in a team of the smartest people that I can get my hands on from, food, pharma, dietary, ag, that have a passion and understanding for cannabis to translate and to share that knowledge to elevate operations, make sure that they're safe, compliant, and profitable. Realizing that just wasn't enough, I started the S3 Collective, standing for Standards, Science, and Safety, last year, which is a 501c3 nonprofit working to accelerate the development of research-based standards to propel the industry forward while ensuring public health and safety.
I can't thank you enough for what you're doing for this industry. And it touches literally everybody that consumes cannabis products all over the place. Flower, vape, edibles, everything that is here is based on standards. And we take these sometimes things for granted until they break, until they fall apart, until they're not being followed. And then someone gets sick, someone dies, something, horrible happens here. So thank you for doing what largely would be many consider and probably unarguably the boring work. But it is so vital and important. I actually think it's anything but boring for this industry. This is going to be probably more of a 100 level show for some of the intro questions here. We're going to get to some juicier things near the end. Part of this show is to help educate and elevate. And I would like to have David on many times, but for our 101 show, we're going to start pretty low. And I hear this thrown around a lot in the industry. What is GMP? Can we just talk about that just to start and definitions here today, David?
Yeah, so GMP, I've heard two great things that it is not. One is get more paper. There is an element of that because if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? You've got to defend your work and have a paper trail. And then genetically modified products, I've also heard. That one kind of threw me for a curveball. Somebody walked up at a conference and it was like, oh my God, genetically modified products. And I was like, no.
It has bad SEO as far as that one goes, but
it's good manufacturing practices. And just look at that word, those three words, good. We're not talking best in class or world class. We're talking good, sufficient. And manufacturing, you can substitute that. There's GAP, there's GXP. These are good insert manufacturing from a post-harvest production standpoint. But there's also good agricultural practices. So you can insert whatever letter choice you want there. And then practices. So, a practice, a way to do things, a best practice, a good, these are good practices. So that's really what it means, is just a way of doing things properly to mitigate public health and safety.
Simple as that. It's really that simple, but it gets a lot more complicated. So when you're setting up these standards, and when I hear GMP, that could mean a number of different things as it relates to this. Is what is good? Somebody's definition of good might be here, and somebody's definition of good might be here. And I think we've seen both in this industry. How do you work through that of defining an ambiguous term like good?
There's a few ways, and I'll try not to get into the 400 level, but the concept of risk is really important, and it kind of underpins this. So let's think about cleaning your dishes. What's the goal? You want clean dishes. How do you do that? I've got a dishwasher. Most folks have a dishwasher. Or maybe you hand wash them. Or maybe you're in a commercial kitchen and you've got a big commercial dishwasher that runs through in 20 minutes at high temperature. That might also be a sanitizer. Or you're camping and you use the good old triple sink method. You've got your soapy water, you've got your fresh water, and then you've got your water with a little bit of bleach. Those are all acceptable practices for cleaning your dishes and sanitizing your dishes. It's not one way to do it. There's multiple ways to do it. The outcome is what matters. And if you think about the level of risk, how dirty is the dish? What's the impact of the dish not being fully clean? What's the impact going to be? That's where you start to define how stringent those good practices need to be.
That defines what good is. That's a really good way of putting it. I wanted to ask that question of you for a bit, but I wanted to wait till we were taping and live here. But that is really good. So starting with the end in mind and understanding what that goal is, and good is defined by achieving that goal with minimal risk if that goal is not met on that one. So, okay. The other question that we have here to go over today is, at both the organizations, we deal with standards, and I've heard of ASTM around. I've heard of ISO. There's some other ones that are there. What is a standard?
So, at its core, right, it's a set way to do something. It's standard lexicon, and standards. There's multiple different types of standards. In the ASTM world, it could be a standard test method, which folks often think about with lab testing. We need standard test methods to ensure that we're having consistent results of cannabinoids or pesticides, you name it. There's standard classifications. There's standard terminology, right? Words matter. So you could have a whole list of terms. That's a way to standardize the industry, right? With certain terms.
So common lexicon, common definitions for what that word means.
Exactly. And then, there's specifications, a standard specification. This product, for example, if you take from a regulatory approach, what's hemp? You could argue that's a standard specification, less than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. That could be an example of a standard specification. And then you've got practices and guides. Again, use the dishwashing example. A guide which could provide the different ways and means in which you can clean your dishes. And, these can be guides or best practices.
Okay. What is not a standard then?
That's a difficult question because it's a good one, right? Because there's also different types of standards as we get into what's not a standard. So I'll focus on voluntary consensus standards because that's the world that I live in. And those are standards that meet global principles that do not create barriers to trade, that allow economies to function, that allow, you and I to talk right now. There's a standard that allows us to have our computers in other time zones to be able to talk to each other. Or a USB, plug, that's a standard. And so these can be industry standards. They can be voluntary consensus standards where there's openness and transparency for industry, for consumers and users, for government, for academia to come together and create that. But then there can be, industry standards, or you could have your own at Flourish, your own internal standards. You have your own way of doing things. Not all standards are created equal, and it's important to recognize that in order for them to be used in commerce, for you to talk to another business, they're not just going to adopt your standard just because you said so. So when we need to engage in trade, we need voluntary consensus standards or globally recognized standards that have been vetted to be used and adopted.
The nature of this industry being federally illegal and it being stood up state by state makes your job that much more interesting. But we'll get to those in a bit. I do have one more preliminary question that we're going to go over here today. What is the difference between compliance and quality?
So I'll run down it's a really good question because it's easy to conflate the two because they do have a relationship. But when you think about compliance, those are the rules. Those are, I'm meeting the rules. I have to file with the Secretary of State to be a business. You have health inspector rules. That's being compliant. Like ServSafe, for example, is a common certificate that folks have in the restaurant industry. That ensures that requires you to have signs about washing. All employees must wash their hands. Has requirements around food temperature, bare minimums, etc. But quality has taken that a step further. It's more than just having the sign and saying I checked the box. It's having a system where you've trained your employees and you know that your employees are washing their hands, not just that there's a sign there. You're going above and beyond. You're looking at not just of the food. Cool, we cooked the food to 165 degrees, so we killed the food, foodborne pathogens, but it's actually palatable.
But does it taste good?
It tastes good, yeah. Good concept. Like anybody can, to a degree, yeah, you can.
For anyone who's had a good burger and a bad burger, if that didn't get you sick, that is the difference between compliance and quality.
They're both compliant, but one has a different level of quality.
I like that. That's important as we're going through this industry. You can grow hemp that is legal hemp, but is not good quality, and you can grow stuff that is good quality. So as we're getting into this, and I'm assuming you're going to say this, but like if you grow something or do something in a compliant manner, it would help to add to it being a quality product. Because if it's non-compliant, it probably is not a quality product. But if it is compliant, there's a better chance of it being a quality product than not.
Yeah, compliance really sets that minimum bar. All right, there's 3 coffee shops within walking distance of my house. They're all compliant as far as I'm concerned. They've all got business licenses, their staff are trained, but there's 3 different reasons why I'll go to those 3 different coffee shops because of their different quality attributes. And if you want to differentiate yourself in a marketplace, just saying I'm compliant with the law doesn't really sell to me. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I always see those food safety standards when I go in. It says satisfactory, and I'm like, I don't want that. I want an A on the wall. Maybe a B plus if I'm hungry, but like
Right.
satisfactory.
Yeah, can we do better?
Let's do better.
Yeah.
Let's do better on that. So, okay. So, like, let's get in now that we've covered some of the bases. We're getting through some of the 101 stuff. With cannabis being in an illegal industry still to this day, to some extent there, how do these standards exist in cannabis?
To a large degree, they don't, right? That's a major part of the issue. So I think about the universal symbol, right? What's a universal warning symbol that's on cannabis products? There are over a dozen right now across the country in different states. So by virtue, it's not universal. And is it really a standard? It's not. It's certainly not an industry standard because there is not one. And so that's a perfect example. This is my favorite symbol because Doctors for Drug Policy Reform, formerly known as Doctors for Cannabis Regulations, came and worked really closely through the ASTM process. And we had several hundred stakeholders engaged across multiple countries to develop that symbol. And we went through all the nerdy details, right? Like, why yellow? Yellow denotes caution. Why not red? Because red means stop, dangerous, right? Don't, stop, do not proceed. This means proceed with caution. The cannabis leaf, because not everybody reads English. And that is a universal symbol that everybody can recognize globally as that might get me high because it's got the pot leaf. And again, it's a triangle. And these are based on this ASTM standard is based on ANSI and ISO standards around global warning signs. So these are already globally recognized. And so that's one symbol, one standard that is now adopted either in reference directly or indirectly in 5 states. We're starting to create those minimum standards to be adopted.
I have a question. Like, are you sometimes in conflict with state regulators? If like, hey, we got a really great idea here, it takes a long time for that state legislation to adopt those standards. And those could sit there for a while. And cannabis is usually not the top priority for any state legislator to be doing those. I mean, when you make it a health and safety thing, it might move things along a little bit quicker than like, allowing beverages in XYZ state. Are you usually receiving a welcome response to these, or is it just like, great idea, we don't have the bandwidth to move this through?
It really depends. All the above, right, Brian? So you called it out well. In an existing marketplace, we already have one that works. Even industry can be rightfully so reluctant because they just bought 300,000 individual cartons, and you're gonna have to throw them all out, put a new symbol on there. So there's real legitimate barriers. There's also barriers around, well, I'd love to change the rules, but it's written into legislation. It's in statute. We can't change it. Statute told us what to do. That's not unique to us. Even think about how we plug our computer into the outlets. North America, we've got the 2 tall, skinny, rectangles in the circle. But in Europe, that's different. In Australia, that's different. We don't have a global standard there, but luckily we got ahead of it. Smart people, about 60, 70 years ago, and got ahead of it. So we only have like 4 internationally. So the idea of like convergence and getting more and more alignment, if we have 80% of the states adopting these standards in 5 years from now, I'd say that's a huge success. Maybe that's attainable. We're not going to get 100% alignment.
And that's why you guys are doing the work that you're doing, just to build that consensus and build that knowledge. And also I guess the proof is in the pudding, though, is like, to your reference point, that symbol is easily identifiable to everybody. As later states adopt on, it's easy to adopt those other standards of like, this is already what's working, and I'm sure you're involved. And we'll get to that in the future in just a bit. What about when we're speaking about like the cultivation and manufacturing? Because you're dealing with agricultural product on one side, and then you're getting to still an agricultural product or food or potentially medicine, or like, how are you dealing with those those best practices and those standards as those are coming along?
So I'm the vice chair of the committee ASTM, Committee D37 on cannabis. And so I'm a volunteer, though. I don't set the stage. I don't set the direction. I'm not writing the standards any more than yourself or one of our other 800 members. And that's kind of the beauty of it. So These are market relevant standards that are driven by the stakeholders. So to go directly to your question, a cultivator, there's multiple ways to clean and disinfect a facility. Like, what does that mean? And if you're a new operator coming online, the benefit of having a standard around how to clean and disinfect a cultivation facility means that you don't have to start from scratch. You can leverage this existing knowledge and say, let's use this minimum. And then you can go in and optimize that from there and find your own ways to maybe be more efficient, less resources, less harsh solvents or cleaning agents, whatever it is. But it sets a starting point. And then the other benefit of that is regulators come in, or inspectors, and they say, hey, how are you keeping these products safe? Well, I'm cleaning and disinfecting. Well, how are you doing that? And why is your method the best? Well, I took this ASTM standard that a bunch of volunteer stakeholder experts, hundreds of them, hashed out and came to consensus on, and then we tweaked it and we improved it. And here's what we did. And they can be like, oh, so you didn't just pull this out of your butt and say, I think this is great. You have, you leverage the knowledge base of the standards.
Are we borrowing standards from agricultural products? Like, I could think wine industry is great because there's a lot of human, like, grape interaction, in wine cultivation and wine production, both in the field and in the actual processing of it, let's call it that way. And then also in manufacturing, you're going to borrow from pharma and food and those items. And like, if you're following those practices on an agricultural product, those have been built and well tested and well developed over time. How did those modify within the cannabis industry? So there's two questions there. I'm assuming we're borrowing. You're nodding your head, so you kind of already answered that was. And like, how do those modify for cannabis? What makes our product a little unique?
Yeah, I'd say we are, and we need to be, at the same time, we need to be doing it more. Still ruthlessly. No idea is ever just totally created in a vacuum. There's some inspiration or idea that was drawn on or modified. A couple examples I'll give. One might be a little bit of a technical example, but it's a relevant one with cultivation. So what's a representative sample? When you've got grow room that's got 4,000 plants, you've got colas on top, you got in the middle part of the plant and the bottom, you've got different sizes of these nugs, and they have different cannabinoid profiles. They vary. So is taking the top cola from the tallest, burliest plant going to be representative of what that entire batch that's going to be packaged into thousands of units and sent to consumers? Heck no, we know that to be false. So guess what? Can you think of anything else in the world that might not be fully representative? I mean, even tomatoes and blueberries and strawberries, they have size differences. What's different though is that this is a product that has the potential to intoxicate or impair you, right? So that THC value matters. And so we can take from botanical products, which there's already guidance on how to characterize a batch, and we can adopt that for cannabis by knowing that bud size matters a bit, where in the canopy it's collected from matters, and set up a sampling scheme that looks at top, middle, and lower, and grabs multiple samples from across that. So we're taking concepts from ag. But then we're also looking at, well, what's unique about cannabis that we have to test for? And then how do we control that? Those are the variables. And so we create a standard for collecting a representative sample of cannabis flower without just coming up, we have to start from scratch.
Just pulling out of nowhere. But like, that's how they're morphed into this, because that's how it's unique to this plant versus dealing with a tobacco plant or a grape. And this is now part of the D37. Is that correct? Is that the initiative specifically for cannabis?
Correct. So ASTM, look around, I get my dry erase marker here, conforms to ASTM D4236. ASTM standards are everywhere in our world. It's the process, which ASTM provides 140 other industries to utilize. Cannabis happens to be the next in the queue of the D series.
How did they get such a low number then?
Yes, we're just D37. With a 37, I think D is like general, getting super specific.
Okay.
But yeah, we're Committee D37. We're a semi-autonomous committee of volunteers from the industry and from regulatory academia that's developing these consensus standards for the scope of cannabis.
So this industry, cannabis has been around for, arguably 10, 15 years, modern regulated cannabis. But like, as Schedule 3 is looking to hopefully come into effect, what are some of the things that we're doing right now, and then also in the near future related toward the evolution of these compliance standards? And like, how is your work at S3 Collective involved in that?
Yeah, no, thanks, Brian. So, there's a few ways. I mean, as you can imagine, there's no shortage of areas that we need to focus on, from the representative sampling to there's no single contaminant list that is uniform across all the states. There's some that are really close, and I think maybe a couple states that have adopted from each other, but 33 pesticides, 66 pesticides, etc. We need to harmonize that in order to have interstate commerce someday. How do we go from California to Oklahoma? How are we going to accept those products into our borders without having total redundancy, having to repackage our product, retest them? So everything from labeling standards. There's a great label standard that took 2.5 years to develop and is now being revised again based on new inputs so that it can be utilized more widely. We've also got this, intoxicating hemp cannabinoids marketplace, and that's really, I'd say, necessitated the need for these standards, because by that token, interstate commerce is here. It already exists. I was in Minnesota a few weeks ago and had a 5 milligram THC beverage that is, fully legal within the state. There's 4,000 establishments in the state of Minnesota where you can legally consume cannabis, cannabinoids.
What a dream world that is.
It was honestly incredible and eye-opening. We're creating those standards so that we can actually engage in a supply chain and have consumers, whether you're in Arkansas, again, name your state, you should know that you're getting the same type of consistent quality product regardless of where you're buying it from. And that doesn't exist today.
Not yet. Have any states, I know we named off a few here, but especially as we're getting into the back half of the 50 states here, have any states signed up to being like, hey, we're just going to follow these standards? They're, as they're maturing, everything's going to be imperfect. And I'm sure standards for that, even that Sharpie marker, are maturing over time. But, the recent news that just popped yesterday as a good example, that there was a significant amount, a very statistically significant amount of products that they pulled that I think had pesticides in them, just from even reading the news blip on those. And I think those were some of the things that were outlawed in Europe, but not here in the United States. And I know that's common with our food system here in America, but that's a whole different story as well. Are any states adopting your standards as a template for growing these?
So there are, and I was actually just at the Cannabis Regulators Association external stakeholders meeting where they convene. I think 33 states were represented there. Industry trade associations were there, academia. I was there representing the S3 Collective in support of ASTM International and our standards, and recognizing that states have limited resources. Typically this is federal government that would come in and establish these minimum standards. They would do the research. There'd be funding from Congress to actually do this research. We have so many barriers, so they've been operating largely in vacuums. And as the standards have been evolving, I can tell you Canada is super active with ASTM. They're engaged at our committee. They come to our committee weeks. They're sharing knowledge. We're facilitating back and forth. They're asking questions. They're making recommendations. They're questioning our standards as they're going through the process, which is exactly what the process is designed to do. It's like the ultimate peer review, so that ultimately regulators can either adopt them. But I also want to just make an important point that that's not the sole and should not be the sole reason to decide whether you use a standard or not. As an industry, in Health Canada has talked about this, and there's guidance at the federal level in the US as well, of when an inspector comes in and says, how are you complying with our regulations? And you can point to a standard that addresses the specificity of how to achieve something, that gives you the bona fides to have credibility. So just because it's not written into law doesn't mean that it's not a best practice to use to help defend why you're doing X, Y, or Z to achieve the outcome of being compliant.
Stand on the knowledge of people who come before you on all this stuff. So that's very interesting. And now, I know this is a lot of talk in our industry right now about Schedule 3 and pharma and CPG and what's going to happen in the future. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because, you are an expert in this field, and, this gets a lot more scrutiny now that we are hopefully going to be beyond a Schedule 1 drug and as things evolve here. So what is the big impact for all of this?
Schedule 3 is significant, but I don't want to overstate it. It puts on the record for the first time that our federal government recognizes that cannabis has currently accepted medical use. That's what Schedule 3 does. Beyond that, yes, 280E will go away based on the tax code. That's for Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances. However, it does not create interstate commerce. It doesn't legalize this product. It's still a controlled substance within the eyes of federal law, and it is still illegal to traffic a controlled substance. It does not create an approved drug. This is not all of a sudden ketamine is now listed here and there's a formulation for ketamine. Like there is a formulation for ketamine that can be dispensed through a pharmaceutical supply chain. There's not a magical cannabis monograph now and an approved drug. There's a process for that. And pharma, the concerns around pharma, I think, are well overstated. If pharma or big tobacco or any big industry wants to be here, they don't need Schedule 3 to do it. There is over 400 investigational new drugs in some phase of the clinical trial process that involve cannabis or cannabinoids. That's been going on since the 70s. Again, I don't want to overstate or understate, but it provides that we have currently accepted medical use. And if we think about how do we get to a fully legal, decriminalized interstate marketplace where consumers can get products regardless of state, this is the pathway. This is a step. This is just another step towards that.
Thanks for giving some clarity on that. I assumed that was going to be your answer, but I have to ask because it is the question du jour of any educational show that we're doing here. And, it does relate toward good practices and how to, make your drugs, but that doesn't change with Schedule 3. It's the same thing that it should have been before, more so now, and even more so in the future as things get bigger. David, one question I have for you is, and I don't know how to phrase this properly, but as the DEA is going through the review process right now, but as the FDA, like we're bringing in a new drug, are they following ASTM or other established standards in setting federal guidelines for this?
Yeah, so it's actually a really great question. Kind of, yes. So the yes explainer behind that is in the 90s, Congress actually put this into law. For folks that want to nerd out and dive in, it's the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act of 1995, NTTAA. But what that does, it provides guidance to executive agencies such as the FDA, to federal agencies, that when they're creating rules, that they must give preference to utilizing voluntary consensus standards because one, you get balanced participation from industry perspectives and public health perspectives. Two, cost savings. And having the bureaucracy of creating rules in a vacuum is tedious, time-consuming, labor-intensive. So Congress recognizes, just as in many other countries, that using voluntary consensus standards is a lot more efficient and functional. So the FDA actually has official guidance about their use and incorporation of voluntary consensus standards. There's case studies. There's over 2,000 ASTM-specific standards referenced in the Code of Federal Regulations for everything from cribs, children's toys, pharmaceutical, medical devices, and so much more.
Oh, interesting. So have you got any calls yet?
The S3 Collective, our nonprofit that we've talked a bit about, we were accepted into the FDA's Network of Experts program fairly recently, which is for nonprofits only to provide expertise from experts on matters of importance to their mission. And so we're the only cannabis, cannabinoid, and psychedelic kind of nonprofit that has that type of scope that's supporting the FDA.
That's exciting news. Congratulations for that. And that's excellent news. I'm glad to hear that. If anybody is interested in either, if you're a cultivator or a manufacturer and interested in learning about some of the work that you're doing with ASTM, D37, and the different organizations that you're involved with, how can they connect with you?
Everybody that's listening should be a member of ASTM Committee D37. If you want the best access to knowledge and to be at the forefront of what's going on and what's coming down the pipeline, come become a member. It's $115 a year to be an individual member. It's open to anybody. Get engaged, learn the voting process, even write a standard, share knowledge. You'll see some amazing peers and some of the best there. I'm the vice chair, so you can easily find me anywhere Committee D37 exists, essentially. We meet virtually and in person fairly often within our technical subcommittees. That's one way. The other way, reach out, sign up for our mailing list at S3 Collective. We loved donations. We are working really hard to accelerate the development of these standards, to fund the research that's needed to bridge the gaps around legitimate questions around product safety, to drive consistency, to be that resource for regulators, for industry, for consumers. So s3collective.org, you can donate, you can sign up for a mailing list. And then last, we provide consulting for regulators, whether it's with rulemaking or advising on these best practices and how to adopt them. Training and education, we implement GMP programs, quality systems, and standards to allow businesses to be more profitable and consistent. We really want to help businesses have predictability and consistency. David at gmpcollective.com. Again, good manufacturing practices, collective.com. We've got a whole team of experts, and come to our website, sign up for our newsletter there as well. We've got a great monthly webinar series on when things go wrong that talks about some of the challenges and horror stories that we've all seen in the industry and how to solve them. So
I am a big fan of that webinar series. If I can't make the shows, I do watch those. Those are very informative. I didn't know things could go wrong in so many different ways. And it's a great title for your show because you learn from everything. It is a process. It's not something that you do once. It is an ongoing process. David, I have to thank you just for your commitment to this industry and trying to bring good health and good standards to this country and this industry and what we're trying to do, and being able to go into a dispensary and have better faith that you're going to be able to get good, well-tested products and setting up a better industry for everybody here. So thank you for your work, David. Best way also to connect with him personally is on LinkedIn. It's David Vaillencourt. It's Vaillencourt. It's at the bottom of the screen right there. David, I don't even know what our 201 show is going to be, but I'm looking forward to getting a little geekier next time with you, and we'll go with that. But David, thank you very much for being on.
Brian, hey, thanks for having me, and I hope everybody learned something today.
I appreciate it. I hope they did.